You know that moment when you're standing in your own kitchen, wearing your best apron, serving wine to your husband and the woman he's been sleeping with, and they're both looking at you like you're the help? That's where this story begins, with the sound of crystal glasses clinking in a toast to their future, while I stood there invisible, holding the serving tray like some kind of domestic ghost in my own home. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. I'm 45 years old, and I thought I understood humiliation. I was wrong. If you stay with me until the end, you'll discover how sometimes the most devastating revenge comes wrapped in the politest smile, and why the best justice is always served at exactly the right temperature. The evening started like so many others had over the past 6 months. David came home from the law firm at exactly 6:30, just like he always did, his briefcase perfectly positioned by the front door, his tie loosened in that calculated way that suggested he'd had a long, important day, making important decisions for important people. What made this evening different was the way he cleared his throat when I greeted him in the foyer, the way his eyes wouldn't quite meet mine, and the casual bomb he dropped while hanging up his coat. "Sarah, I've invited someone from the office for dinner tonight. I hope that's not too much trouble." His voice carried that particular tone he used when he wasn't really asking, when he'd already made the decision and was simply informing me of my role in whatever drama he'd scripted for the evening. I paused in folding his jacket, my hands stilling on the expensive wool. David never brought work colleagues home. In 18 years of marriage, our dinner table had hosted his law partners exactly twice, both times for carefully orchestrated events designed to advance his career. Our home was his sanctuary, he'd always said, the place where he could escape the demands of his practice and just be himself. The fact that he was breaking this sacred rule sent alarm bells ringing in the back of my mind, but I pushed them down, with the practiced efficiency of a woman who'd spent nearly 2 decades managing her husband's moods and expectations. "Of course not," I said, forcing brightness into my voice. "Who should I expect? I'll need to adjust the menu accordingly." I was already mentally calculating portions, wondering if I had enough of the good wine, if the tablecloth was pressed, if the dining room was presentable for whatever colleague David deemed worthy of our domestic stage. Elena Martinez from the firm. She's been working on the Henderson case with me, and we have some details to iron out before tomorrow's hearing. He was already walking away from me, heading toward his study with the air of a man who considered the conversation concluded. Nothing too formal, just dinner and some business discussion. Elena Martinez. I knew the name, though I'd never met the woman. David had mentioned her occasionally over the past year, always in the context of work, always with the kind of professional respect he reserved for colleagues he considered competent. She was a junior associate, hired fresh from Harvard Law, brilliant and ambitious according to David's occasional references. Young, I remembered him saying once, but mature beyond her years. Sharp, the kind of lawyer who could go far in the right firm. Standing there in our foyer, holding my husband's coat and processing this unexpected development, I felt the first flutter of something I couldn't quite name. Not suspicion exactly, because David had never given me reason to doubt his fidelity. He was many things, demanding, particular, sometimes dismissive, but unfaithful had never been on the list of his character flaws. Still, there was something about the way he'd delivered this information, something studied and careful that didn't match the casual business dinner he was describing. I shook off the feeling and headed to the kitchen to reassess my dinner plans. I'd been preparing David's favorite, beef Wellington with roasted vegetables, a meal that required timing and attention, but had become second nature after years of perfecting it for his palate. Now I needed to stretch it for 3, which meant adjusting seasonings, adding another vegetable side, perhaps preparing a more elaborate dessert to compensate for smaller portions. The mechanics of hospitality were familiar territory, a dance I'd been performing for most of my adult life. The kitchen had always been my domain, the one space in our Westchester home where I felt completely in control. It was a beautiful room, designed during our renovation 5 years earlier with professional-grade appliances and enough counter space to cater a small party. David had spared no expense, telling the designer that his wife was a serious cook who deserved serious tools. It was one of the few times in our marriage when I'd felt truly seen, when his investment in my interests felt like investment in me as a person, rather than as an extension of his own needs. I pulled out my phone and scrolled through my contact list, looking for the number of Giovanni's, the Italian market downtown that carried the best fresh pasta and imported cheeses. If I was going to entertain David's colleague, I wanted to make a good impression. It occurred to me as I dialed that I cared about making a good impression on this woman I'd never met, this Elena Martinez, who was important enough to David that he'd break his own rules about mixing work and home life. "Mrs. Thompson!" Giovanni's warm voice filled my ear. "What can I do for you today?" "Hi, Giovanni. I need a favor. I'm having an unexpected dinner guest tonight, and I want to add a pasta course. Do you have any of that fresh linguine I love? And maybe some of the burrata? For you, always. I'll have Tony bring it by in an hour. The good olive oil too, yes? The one from my cousin's farm?" This was why I loved Giovanni. He understood that food was love, that the right ingredients could transform a simple meal into an expression of care and attention. Perfect. Thank you so much. With the pasta course arranged, I returned to my original menu with renewed confidence. Beef Wellington for the main course, roasted asparagus with lemon and parmesan, garlic roasted potatoes, the fresh linguine with a simple preparation that would let the quality of the ingredients shine. And for dessert, my grandmother's tiramisu that I kept in the freezer for special occasions. It was a menu that spoke of sophistication without ostentation, the kind of meal that said, I understood good food without trying too hard to impress. As I worked, seasoning the beef tenderloin and preparing the mushroom duxelles that would wrap around it, I found myself thinking about Elena Martinez. What kind of woman was she? What had prompted David to invite her into our home? Was she married? Did she have children? In 18 years of marriage, I'd developed a detailed mental catalog of David's colleagues, their wives, their family situations, their professional trajectories. It was part of being a lawyer's wife, understanding the ecosystem that surrounded your husband's career, knowing how to navigate the social complexities that came with his professional relationships. But Elena Martinez was a blank space in that catalog, a new variable in the carefully balanced equation of our life. Young and brilliant, David had said. Harvard educated. Working closely with him on important cases. As I folded the puff pastry around the seasoned beef, I wondered what she looked like, how she dressed, whether she was the type of ambitious young lawyer who wore severe suits and sensible shoes, or whether she was more modern, more fashion-conscious. Did she know about me? Had David mentioned his wife during their long hours working together on the Henderson case? The doorbell rang at exactly 7:30, and I heard David's footsteps, crossing the foyer to answer it. I was in the dining room, lighting the candles I'd placed between arrangements of white roses from our garden, when I heard his voice welcoming our guest. There was warmth in his tone that I hadn't heard in months, an enthusiasm that made me pause with the match still burning between my fingers. "Elena, come in. Sarah's prepared something wonderful for us." His voice carried clearly through the house, and I caught something in it that made my stomach tighten. Not just warmth, but intimacy. The kind of comfortable familiarity that usually took months or years to develop between colleagues. I blew out the match and smoothed my dress, a navy blue wrap that David had always complimented, paired with the pearl necklace he'd given me for our 15th anniversary. I'd wanted to look appropriate for entertaining his colleague. Professional, but not intimidating. Elegant, but approachable. Now, hearing that warmth in his voice, I wondered if I'd chosen correctly. Elena Martinez was not what I'd expected. She was younger than I'd anticipated, probably early 30s, with glossy black hair pulled back in a sophisticated chignon, and the kind of bone structure that suggested good genetics and expensive skincare. She wore a wine-colored silk blouse, with tailored black pants and heels that added 3 inches to her already impressive height. But it wasn't her beauty that stopped me cold as I emerged from the dining room to greet them. It was the way she looked at my husband, and more importantly, the way he looked back at her. "Sarah, this is Elena Martinez." David's hand was resting lightly on Elena's elbow as he made the introduction, a gesture that could have been purely professional but felt charged with something more personal. "Elena, my wife Sarah." Elena stepped forward with a smile that was perfectly calibrated, warm enough to seem genuine but not so warm as to suggest we were going to be best friends. "Mrs. Thompson, it's such a pleasure to finally meet you. David talks about you constantly." The words were exactly right, but there was something in her eyes that contradicted them, a flicker of assessment that made me feel like I was being measured against some internal standard. "Please, call me Sarah, and it's lovely to meet you, too. David's told me so much about your work on the Henderson case." I extended my hand, noting that Elena's handshake was firm without being aggressive, another perfectly calibrated gesture from a woman who clearly understood the importance of first impressions. "I hope you don't mind me crashing your evening," Elena said, directing her words to me but glancing at David as she spoke. "When David mentioned you were making dinner, I almost insisted on taking you both out instead. It seems terribly presumptuous to impose on your hospitality." "Nonsense," I replied automatically. "I love cooking for guests. Besides, David says you have important business to discuss. Much better to do it somewhere comfortable than in some noisy restaurant." This was the moment when I should have seen it, should have recognized the signs that were so clear in retrospect. The way Elena's smile tightened almost imperceptibly when I mentioned the business discussion. The way David shifted slightly, positioning himself between us like a buffer. The way neither of them quite met my eyes when I referenced the work they supposedly needed to discuss. But I was focused on being the perfect hostess, on representing my husband's household in the best possible light, and I missed the first clear warning that this evening was not what it appeared to be. "Can I offer you something to drink?" I asked, already moving toward the living room where we kept the good liquor. "Wine? Cocktail? David usually has a scotch when he gets home, but I can make whatever you prefer." "Wine would be lovely," Elena said, following me into the living room while David disappeared upstairs, presumably to change out of his work clothes. "Red if you have it, and please don't go to any trouble. I feel guilty enough already about disrupting your routine." I poured her a glass of the Barolo I'd been saving for a special occasion, wondering if entertaining David's brilliant young colleague qualified as special enough. "It's no trouble at all. How are you finding the firm?" "David says you're fitting in beautifully." Elena accepted the wine with another perfectly measured smile. "Everyone's been wonderful. It's a big adjustment. Moving to New York from Boston, learning new systems, new people. But David's been incredibly supportive. I don't know what I would have done without his guidance these past months." There it was again, that subtle emphasis on my husband's name, the way she said it like it belonged to her as much as it did to me. I poured myself a glass of wine and tried to ignore the growing unease that was settling in my chest like a cold stone. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Have you found a place you like? The housing market around here can be challenging for someone new to the area. I was making conversation, filling the space while we waited for David to return, but I was also fishing for information. Where did Elena Martinez live? How had she integrated herself into our community? How often did she and David work late together? How many dinners had they shared that I didn't know about? "I found a lovely little place in the village," she said, settling onto our cream-colored sofa with the casual familiarity of someone who felt completely at home. "Nothing too grand, but it suits me perfectly. Close enough to walk to work on nice days. Far enough from the main street to be quiet. David actually helped me find it. He knows all the best real estate agents in the area. David had helped her find an apartment. David, who barely knew the names of our own neighbors, who had never shown the slightest interest in real estate beyond our own property, had taken time out of his busy schedule to help his young colleague find housing. The cold stone in my chest grew heavier. That was thoughtful of him, I managed, taking a larger sip of wine than I'd intended. David's always been good at taking care of people. The words came out slightly bitter, and I saw Elena's eyebrows raise fractionally. I forced a laugh. What I mean is, he's very considerate when it comes to work relationships. He understands how important it is for everyone to feel settled and supported. Elena's smile grew warmer, more genuine. He really is. I've never worked for someone who was so invested in my success. It makes all the difference, feeling like your mentor truly believes in your potential. Mentor. The word hit me like a physical blow. In 18 years of marriage, David had never described himself as anyone's mentor. He was a boss, a partner, a colleague, but never a mentor. Mentoring implied personal investment, ongoing attention, a relationship that extended beyond the immediate demands of casework. Mentoring was personal in a way that David's other professional relationships had never been. David reappeared then, changed into casual slacks and a sweater that I'd bought him for Christmas, looking relaxed and comfortable in a way that stood in sharp contrast to his usual post-work tension. He'd even combed his hair, I noticed, something he rarely bothered with when it was just the two of us for dinner. "Sorry to keep you waiting," he said, moving directly to Elena and refilling her wine glass without being asked. "I hope Sarah's been entertaining you properly." "Your wife is lovely," Elena said. And again I caught that subtle possessiveness in the way she said "your wife," like she was reminding herself of an inconvenient fact rather than acknowledging a pleasant reality. "And this wine is incredible. I'm going to have to get the name of your wine shop." "Giovanni's downtown," I said automatically. "They have an excellent selection. David and I have been shopping there for years." I emphasized the years, suddenly feeling the need to assert the longevity of my relationship with my husband, the depth of our shared history, the accumulated weight of our life together. David settled into his usual chair, the leather recliner, that had molded itself to his body over the years, and I noticed that he angled it slightly toward the sofa where Elena was sitting. "Elena's quite the wine enthusiast," he said to me, but his eyes were on her. "She's been educating me about different regions, different vintages. I had no idea how much there was to learn." This was news to me. David had never shown any interest in wine beyond drinking it. I was the one who researched vineyards, who planned our tastings during vacations, who built our modest but respectable wine collection. The idea that he was suddenly enthusiastic about viticulture and that Elena was his teacher felt like another small betrayal. "How wonderful," I said, my voice sounding strange and bright even to my own ears. "I'd love to hear about what you've been learning. Maybe you could recommend some new bottles for us to try." Elena launched into a detailed discussion of Oregon Pinot Noirs, her face animated in a way that made her even more beautiful. David listened with rapt attention, asking intelligent questions, making observations that suggested he'd been paying very close attention to previous conversations on this topic. I sat there watching them, feeling increasingly like an audience member at a play I hadn't known I'd bought tickets for. The timer in the kitchen saved me from having to contribute to a conversation I clearly wasn't qualified to join. "Excuse me," I said, rising to check on the beef Wellington. "I'll just be a moment." In the kitchen, I pressed my hands against the cool granite countertop and tried to process what I was witnessing. Elena Martinez was beautiful, intelligent, sophisticated, and clearly comfortable in my home in a way that suggested this wasn't her first visit. David was animated and engaged in a way I hadn't seen in months, maybe years. They shared interests I didn't even know David had developed, references to conversations and experiences that had happened outside my awareness. But they were colleagues, I reminded myself. It made sense that they would develop a rapport, that they would discover common interests during the long hours they spent working together. Just because I felt excluded didn't mean anything inappropriate was happening. Just because David seemed more interested in Elena's conversation than he'd been in mine recently didn't mean our marriage was in trouble. The beef. Wellington was perfect, golden and fragrant, the pastry crisp and the meat still pink in the center. I carved it carefully, arranging the slices on our best serving platter, and told myself that I was being paranoid, jealous of a perfectly innocent professional relationship, because my own life had become so small and contained that I'd forgotten how exciting new friendships could be. When I returned to the living room carrying the platter, I found David and Elena sitting closer together on the sofa, their heads bent over Elena's phone as she showed him something on the screen. They looked up when I entered, but not quickly, not with the guilty haste that would have confirmed my growing suspicions. Instead, they looked at me with the mild annoyance of people who'd been interrupted during an interesting conversation. "Dinner is ready," I announced, setting the platter on the coffee table where the rich aroma of beef and herbs immediately filled the room. "Elena, I hope you like beef. I should have asked about dietary restrictions when David told me you were coming." "It smells incredible," Elena said, rising gracefully from the sofa. "And I eat everything. One of the advantages of being single, I don't have to accommodate anyone else's preferences." Single. She'd emphasized the word slightly, and I saw David's reaction, the way his eyes flicked to her face and held there for just a moment longer than necessary. Single and beautiful and brilliant and interested in wine, and probably a dozen other things that David found fascinating and that I'd never bothered to explore. We moved to the dining room, where I'd set the table with our wedding china and the crystal glasses David's mother had given us as an engagement gift. Elena complimented the table setting, the flowers, the way the candlelight played across the polished wood of the antique table that had belonged to my grandmother. I thanked her and served the beef, noting that David didn't compliment the meal, even though it was perfectly prepared, even though it was his favorite dish and I'd spent hours making sure every element was exactly right. Instead, he continued his conversation with Elena about wine regions, about restaurants they'd apparently visited together during business lunches, about places they wanted to try in the future. I listened and served and refilled glasses and felt increasingly invisible, like a well-trained server in an expensive restaurant whose job was to facilitate the experience without actually participating in it. "Sarah made the pasta herself," David said when I brought out the linguine course, and I felt a brief moment of hope that he was finally including me in the conversation. "She's quite accomplished in the kitchen." But even that compliment felt wrong somehow. It wasn't pride in his voice, but rather the tone someone might use to praise a particularly skilled housekeeper. He was presenting my cooking abilities to Elena like evidence of my usefulness rather than celebrating my talents. "It's delicious," Elena said, and her praise felt more genuine than David's had. "I'm hopeless in the kitchen. I live on takeout and whatever I can manage in a microwave. This is such a treat." I found myself warming to her despite my growing unease. She was asking me about the pasta sauce, about where I'd learned to cook, about whether I'd ever considered opening a restaurant. For the first time all evening, I felt like a participant in the conversation rather than a bystander. But then, David redirected the discussion back to work, back to the Henderson case and the strategies they were developing, and I was relegated to observer status once again. I cleared plates and brought dessert and refilled wine glasses while they talked about legal precedents and witness testimony and courtroom tactics. Occasionally, one of them would glance in my direction and smile, acknowledging my presence the way people acknowledge waitstaff, polite but distant. It was during dessert, while Elena was praising my tiramisu and David was explaining some complex point of law, that I realized what was actually happening in my dining room. This wasn't a business dinner. This wasn't a casual meeting between colleagues who needed to iron out case details. This was a date, happening at my table, in my home, with me serving as the unwitting facilitator of my husband's courtship of another woman. The realization hit me so hard I nearly dropped the coffee cup I was raising to my lips. I set it down carefully, my hands suddenly unsteady, and looked at my husband and his colleague, his mentee, his whatever she was, with new eyes. The way he leaned toward her when she spoke, the way she touched his arm when she laughed, the way they both seemed to forget I was in the room until they needed something refilled or cleared or brought from the kitchen. I excused myself and went to the bathroom, needing a moment to process what I'd discovered, to figure out how to respond to this betrayal that was happening in real time in my own home. In the mirror, my face looked pale and shocked, my carefully applied makeup unable to hide the devastation I felt building behind my eyes. When I returned to the dining room, Elena was checking her watch. "I should probably head home," she said, though she made no immediate move to leave. "Early morning tomorrow, and I want to review my notes one more time before the hearing." "Of course," I said, proud of how normal my voice sounded. "Let me get your coat." But as I moved toward the front closet, David was already standing, already moving to help Elena with her things. I watched from the dining room doorway as he held her coat, as his hands lingered on her shoulders after he'd helped her into it, as she turned to face him in the small space of our foyer. "Thank you for dinner," she said, her voice softer now, more intimate. "And thank you for everything else. I know how lucky I am to have you as a mentor." There was that word again, but this time it sounded like a code, like a socially acceptable term for something that couldn't be spoken aloud in front of the wife. David's response was too quiet for me to hear, but I saw Elena smile, saw her reach up and straighten his collar in a gesture that was unmistakably possessive, unmistakably personal. They stood there for another moment, close enough that I could have fit between them only with difficulty, looking at each other with an intimacy that made my chest ache. Then Elena was gone, and David was returning to the dining room with the satisfied expression of a man who'd had a very successful evening. "That went well," he said, beginning to stack the dirty dessert plates. Elena was impressed with dinner. "You did a beautiful job, Sarah." I looked at my husband, this man I'd been married to for 18 years, and realized I had no idea who he was anymore. "She seems lovely," I said carefully. "Very intelligent, very beautiful." "She is," David agreed, and there was warmth in his voice that he hadn't used when talking about me in months. "She's going to go far in this profession. She has excellent instincts." I nodded and began clearing the table, my movements automatic after years of post-dinner cleanup routines. David disappeared into his study, probably to call Elena and debrief about the evening, to plan their next encounter, to say the things he couldn't say in front of me. Standing in my kitchen washing the dishes from the dinner I'd prepared for my husband and his lover, I felt something cold and hard settling in my chest. It wasn't heartbreak, not yet. Heartbreak would come later, when I'd had time to process the full scope of what I'd witnessed. This was something more immediate and more dangerous. This was rage, pure and clean and focused, building like pressure in a sealed container. David thought he was clever, bringing her here, making me serve them, making me complicit in their affair. He thought I was too naive, too trusting, too dependent on him to recognize what was happening right in front of me. He thought he could use my hospitality as cover for his betrayal, my cooking as the backdrop for his courtship of another woman. He was wrong. And before this was over, I was going to make sure he understood exactly how wrong he'd been. The next morning, David left for work with the same routine he'd maintained for 18 years. Coffee in his travel mug, briefcase by the door, perfunctory kiss on my cheek as he headed out to catch the 7:15 train. The only difference was the spring in his step, the way he hummed under his breath while adjusting his tie, the satisfied smile that played at the corners. of his mouth when he thought I wasn't watching. I waited until I heard his car pull out of the driveway before I moved. Then I did something I'd never done in 18 years of marriage. I went into David's study and began searching through his things. The study was David's sanctuary, a room I'd helped him design but rarely entered uninvited. Dark wood shelves lined with law books, a massive mahogany desk that had belonged to his father, leather chairs positioned around a small conference table where he sometimes met with clients. Everything in perfect order, everything in its designated place, just like David himself. I started with his desk, though I wasn't sure what I was looking for. Evidence, I supposed, though evidence of what exactly remained unclear. I knew what I'd witnessed the night before, but intuition and suspicion weren't the same as proof. If David was having an affair with Elena Martinez, he was too smart to leave obvious traces lying around his home office. The desk drawers yielded nothing but the usual detritus of a busy legal practice: client files, billing records, correspondence with other attorneys, business cards from court reporters and expert witnesses. Everything professional, everything legitimate, everything exactly what you'd expect to find in a successful lawyer's workspace. But then I opened the bottom drawer, the deep one where David kept his personal files, and found something that made my breath catch in my throat. Tucked between folders containing our tax returns and insurance policies was a slim manila envelope with no label, no identifying marks. Inside were photographs. Not compromising photographs, nothing that would constitute evidence of an affair in any legal sense, but photographs that told a story nonetheless. David and Elena at what appeared to be a restaurant, leaning across a small table in animated conversation. Elena laughing at something David had said, her hand resting on his forearm. David and Elena walking down a tree-lined street, close enough that their shoulders were touching. Elena in profile, looking at something outside the camera's range, while David watched her with an expression I recognized but hadn't seen directed at me in years. I sank into David's leather chair, holding the photographs with hands that weren't quite steady. These weren't random snapshots from office parties or work events. These were deliberate portraits of two people who clearly cared about each other, captured by someone who understood the significance of what they were documenting, someone who was building a record. The question was whether David was keeping these photographs as mementos of his affair, or whether someone else had taken them and provided them to him. Were these souvenirs or warnings? Love letters or blackmail? Material? I studied the backgrounds of the photographs more carefully, trying to identify locations and establish timelines. The restaurant looked expensive, intimate, the kind of place where business colleagues might go for a working lunch, but where married men and unmarried women definitely went for more personal reasons. The street scene was harder to place, though. The architecture suggested somewhere in Manhattan, possibly near the firm's offices. But it was the last photograph in the envelope that made my stomach clench with something approaching nausea. David and Elena standing outside what appeared to be an apartment building. Elena fumbling with keys while David stood close behind her, his hand resting on the small of her back in a gesture that was unmistakably protective, unmistakably intimate. They were both smiling, but not at the camera. They were smiling at each other, lost in their own private moment, oblivious to whoever was documenting their liaison. I recognized the building. It was the place Elena had mentioned the night before, the lovely little place in the village that David had helped her find. Suddenly, that innocent-sounding assistance took on a much more sinister cast. David hadn't just helped Elena find an apartment. He'd helped her find a place where they could conduct their affair without being observed by neighbors who might recognize him, somewhere discreet and convenient and safe from prying eyes. My hands were shaking as I returned the photographs to their envelope and replaced it in the drawer exactly where I'd found it. David was careful, methodical, but he wasn't perfect. He'd kept these photographs for a reason, and that reason was either sentimentality or insurance. Either way, they represented leverage. and I was beginning to understand that leverage was something I was going to need. I spent the rest of the morning in a strange state of suspended animation, going through the motions of my usual routine while my mind churned through possibilities and implications. I made the bed with military precision, folded laundry with obsessive attention to detail, organized the kitchen cabinets with the kind of focus that comes from needing to control something, anything, in a world that had suddenly shifted off its axis. But underneath the domestic busywork, I was planning. If David thought he could humiliate me in my own home, if he thought he could use my hospitality as cover for his affair, if he thought I was too naive or too dependent to recognize what he was doing, then he had seriously underestimated the woman he'd married. I needed more information. The photographs were a start, but they raised more questions than they answered. How long had this affair been going on? How serious was it? Were they just sleeping together? Or was David planning to leave me for his brilliant young protege? Was this Elena's first affair with a married man? Or was she practiced at this kind of manipulation? Most importantly, what were David's plans for the future? Was he going to ask for a divorce? Or was he planning to maintain this double life indefinitely? The answers to these questions would determine my response. If David wanted a divorce, I could at least respect his honesty, even if I couldn't forgive his betrayal. But if he was planning to keep me as his domestic staff while conducting his real emotional life with Elena Martinez, then he was going to discover that his compliant wife had more spine than he'd ever imagined. I started with the phone bills. David and I had a shared cell phone plan, and I had access to all the account information online. I'd never bothered to review the detailed billing before because I'd had no reason to monitor my husband's communications. Trust had been the foundation of our marriage, or at least I'd thought it was. Now I was learning that trust was just another word for willful blindness. The pattern emerged immediately once I knew what to look for. David's call history showed regular communication with Elena's number, far more frequent than what would be necessary for purely professional collaboration. Text messages sent late at night and early in the morning, lengthy phone conversations that happened during David's commute and lunch breaks, communication that continued even on weekends when no urgent legal work would require such constant contact. But it was the timing that made the scope of the betrayal clear. The increased communication with Elena's number corresponded almost exactly with a decrease in David's communication with me. As his calls and texts to her had intensified over the past 6 months, his attention to me had diminished proportionally. Dinners where he claimed to be too tired to talk, weekends where he disappeared into his study for hours at a time, evenings when he went to bed early or stayed up late working on cases that apparently required extensive consultation with his junior associate. I printed out 6 months of phone records and spread them across the kitchen table, highlighting the patterns with different colored markers like a detective working a complex case. What emerged was a timeline of seduction, a record of 2 people, growing closer while one of them grew more distant from his spouse. It was methodical and deliberate, and absolutely damning. Armed with this evidence, I began to understand the full scope of what David had been hiding from me. This wasn't a momentary indiscretion or a temporary lapse in judgment. This was a sustained campaign of deception that had been going on for months while I remained obliviously focused on maintaining our home and supporting his career. The humiliation was almost overwhelming. How many people at David's firm knew about his affair? How many social gatherings had I attended where people whispered about my husband's beautiful young girlfriend while I smiled and played the role of the devoted wife? How many times had David lied directly to my face about where he was going and who he was seeing? But beneath the humiliation was something harder and colder. Anger, yes, but also a kind of calculating fury that surprised me with its intensity. David had made a mistake by bringing Elena into our home, by making me complicit in their relationship, by treating me like hired help in my own dining room. He'd revealed his hand, shown me exactly how little he respected me, demonstrated his absolute confidence that I would never challenge him or demand accountability for his actions. That confidence was about to prove catastrophically misplaced. I spent the afternoon researching Elena Martinez with the same methodical attention I'd once applied to planning dinner parties and organizing charity events. Social media made the investigation surprisingly easy. Elena's Instagram account was public, filled with carefully curated photographs that told the story of an ambitious young woman building a sophisticated urban lifestyle. There were pictures of expensive meals at trendy restaurants, weekend trips, to wine country, designer clothing and accessories that seemed well beyond what a junior associate's salary should support. But it was the photographs that didn't include David that proved most interesting. Elena at various social events, always impeccably dressed, always photographed with other young professionals who looked like they belonged to the same social circle. Elena at charity galas and art gallery openings and rooftop parties, environments where a beautiful single woman could meet successful older men who might be interested in providing mentorship and other forms of support. This wasn't Elena's first rodeo. The evidence was subtle but clear once you knew how to read it. Designer handbags that appeared and disappeared from her photos, suggesting gifts from admirers who preferred not to be associated with their generosity, permanently. Expensive jewelry that showed up for special occasions and then vanished, probably returned to wherever it had come from once the event was over. Weekend trips to luxury destinations that were tagged with vague location markers, suggesting she was traveling with someone who preferred to maintain their privacy. Elena Martinez was a predator, sophisticated and calculating, and very, very good at what she did. She'd identified David as a target, probably researched his background and his marriage, and then positioned herself perfectly to take advantage of his midlife vulnerability and professional vanity. The fact that she was genuinely intelligent and competent at her job only made her more dangerous, because it provided plausible cover for the time they spent together and the attention he lavished on her. But even predators made mistakes when they got overconfident, and Elena had made a big one by accepting David's invitation to dinner at our home. She'd let me see them together, let me witness the intimacy that had developed between them, let me understand exactly what was happening right in front of me. She'd underestimated me just as badly as David had, assuming that a suburban housewife would be too naive or too intimidated to recognize sophisticated manipulation when she saw it. That assumption was going to cost her dearly. By evening, I had assembled a comprehensive dossier on my husband's affair, phone records that documented the pattern of their communication, photographs that captured their intimacy, social media evidence that revealed Elena's history of targeting successful married men, and timeline that showed exactly how David's behavior toward me had changed as his relationship with Elena had intensified. But evidence wasn't enough. If I confronted David directly, he would deny everything, claim that his relationship with Elena was purely professional, accuse me of paranoia and jealousy and whatever other character flaws might explain away my suspicions. Men like David were masters at gaslighting, at making their victims doubt their own perceptions and question their own sanity. If I wanted justice, if I wanted David and Elena to face real consequences for what they'd done to me and to our marriage, I needed more than evidence. I needed leverage. I needed to catch them in circumstances where denial was impossible, where their lies would collapse under the weight of incontrovertible proof. I needed to be smart about this, to plan my revenge as carefully as Elena had planned her seduction. David thought he was the chess master, moving pieces around the board while I remained obliviously focused on domestic trivia. He was about to learn that he'd been playing against a worthy opponent all along. When David came home that evening, I was waiting for him with dinner prepared and the dining room set for two. He seemed surprised to find the table laid with our good china again, candles lit, a bottle of wine already open and breathing. "This is lovely," he said, though I caught a flicker of concern in his eyes. "What's the occasion?" "No occasion," I replied, serving him a plate of the salmon I'd prepared with lemon and herbs. "I just thought it would be nice to have a quiet dinner together." We don't do that often enough anymore. David relaxed, settling into his chair with the satisfied air of a man who believed his deceptions were secure. You're right. I've been working too hard lately, spending too much time at the office. Maybe I should try to get home earlier more often. The Henderson case is keeping you busy, I said, pouring wine into his glass. Elena mentioned that you're working very closely together on the strategy. I watched his face as I said her name, looking for tells, for micro-expressions that might reveal his emotional state. There was a slight tightening around his eyes, a barely perceptible pause before he responded, but his voice remained steady and professional. She's been invaluable, he said. Brilliant legal mind, excellent instincts. I'm lucky to have her assistance on such a complex case. She's very beautiful too, I added casually, taking a sip of my wine. And so young. It must be refreshing to work with someone who brings such energy and enthusiasm to the job. Now David was definitely uncomfortable, shifting in his chair, his fork pausing halfway to his mouth. I hadn't really noticed, he said, which was such an obvious lie that I almost laughed. I try to maintain professional boundaries with all my colleagues, regardless of their personal attributes. Professional boundaries. The irony was almost overwhelming. Of course, I said, though it must be challenging sometimes, spending so many long hours together, working late into the evening, traveling together for depositions and court appearances. That kind of intensity can create bonds between colleagues. David set down his fork and looked at me directly for the first time since coming home. Sarah, is there something specific you want to ask me? Because if you have concerns about my professional relationships, I'd rather address them directly than dance around the subject. This was the moment of truth. I could confront him now, lay out everything I'd discovered, demand explanations, and apologies and promises to end his affair. But confrontation would give him the opportunity to minimize and deflect and gradually work his way back into my good graces while continuing his relationship with Elena more carefully. Instead, I smiled and reached across the table to touch his hand. I'm sorry if I sounded suspicious. I know how dedicated you are to your work, and I admire your commitment to mentoring young lawyers. Elena clearly thinks the world of you, and I can see why. You've always been generous with your time and expertise when it comes to helping others succeed. David's relief was palpable. I appreciate you saying that, and I want you to know that my work with Elena, with all my colleagues, is strictly professional. You're the only woman in my life who matters, Sarah. You're my wife, my partner, my best friend. Nothing and no one could ever change that. The lies rolled off his tongue so smoothly, with such apparent sincerity, that I found myself almost impressed by his performance. David had clearly had practice at this kind of deception, which made me wonder how many other affairs there might have been over the years, how many other bright young women had caught his attention and received his mentorship. But that was a question for another day. Tonight, I was focused on gathering intelligence and establishing my own credibility as a trusting, naive wife who suspected nothing and posed no threat to his carefully constructed double life. I love you too, I said, squeezing his hand. And I want you to know that I trust you completely. I always have and I always will. The rest of dinner passed pleasantly, with David relaxing back into his familiar patterns of discussing his day at the office, while I listened attentively and asked appropriate questions. He even complimented the salmon, something he hadn't done, with my cooking in months. Apparently, guilt was an effective seasoning. As I cleared the dishes and prepared coffee, David announced that he needed to spend some time in his study reviewing documents for the next day's proceedings. Big day. Tomorrow, he said. Elena and I are presenting our opening arguments in the Henderson case. We've been preparing for weeks, but I want to run through my notes one more time. Of course, I said. I'll try to keep the noise down so you can concentrate. David disappeared into his study, and within minutes I could hear his voice through the closed door, speaking in the low, intimate tones he used for private phone conversations. He was calling Elena, presumably to coordinate their strategy for the next day's proceedings, though I suspected their conversation would cover more than just legal tactics. I finished cleaning the kitchen, loaded the dishwasher, and went upstairs to our bedroom with a cup of tea and the novel I'd been trying to read for the past month. But instead of reading, I sat at my vanity and stared at my reflection in the mirror, trying to recognize the woman looking back at me. 18 years of marriage had changed me in ways I was only beginning to understand. I'd adapted myself to David's needs and preferences so gradually that I'd lost track of my own identity somewhere along the way. I'd become the perfect lawyer's wife, polished and presentable and completely devoted to supporting his career and maintaining his comfort. I'd made myself indispensable as a hostess and housekeeper and social coordinator, while allowing my own dreams and ambitions to fade into irrelevance. But that woman, that perfectly adapted wife and hostess, had also learned things over the years. She'd learned how to read people, how to manage complex social dynamics, how to plan and execute elaborate events while making everything appear effortless. She'd learned how to smile while furious, how to maintain composure under pressure, how to present a calm exterior while calculating her next move. Those skills were about to prove very useful. The woman in the mirror smiled back at me, and for the first time in months, I felt like I was looking at someone I recognized. Not the naive housewife David thought he'd married, not the trusting victim Elena thought she could ignore, but someone harder and smarter, and infinitely more dangerous than either of them had imagined. David's affair was going to be the biggest mistake of his life, but he wasn't going to realize that until it was far too late to do anything about it. The next morning brought the first test of my new strategy. David mentioned over breakfast that he would be working late again, preparing for the next phase of the Henderson case with Elena. They had dinner reservations at Romano's, he said, a quiet place where they could discuss strategy without being interrupted by colleagues or clients. Romano's was the same restaurant I'd identified in one of the photographs from David's desk drawer. It was also the restaurant where David had taken me for our 5th wedding anniversary, where he'd promised that our marriage would only grow stronger with time, where we'd planned the renovation of our home and talked about the children we thought we might have someday. The symbolism was either unconsciously cruel or deliberately hurtful, and I wasn't sure which possibility made me angrier. "That sounds very productive," I said, buttering my toast with steady hands. "I'm sure Elena appreciates how much time and attention you're dedicating to her development as a lawyer." "She's worth the investment," David replied, not catching the double meaning in his own words. "I think she has the potential to be a real star in this profession if she gets the right guidance and support." I nodded and sipped my coffee and mentally added Romano's to the list of locations I would be monitoring that evening. David thought he was conducting a discreet affair, but he was actually following a predictable pattern that was going to make surveillance remarkably easy. After he left for work, I spent the morning preparing for what I'd come to think of as phase 2 of my investigation. If David and Elena were going to have dinner at Romano's, I was going to be there to document it. Not to confront them, not to make a scene, but to gather the kind of evidence that would be undeniable when the time came for accountability. I'd never followed anyone before, never conducted surveillance, never taken photographs of unsuspecting targets. But I discovered that I had a natural aptitude for observation and planning that surprised me. Maybe it was all those years of organizing, charity events and dinner parties, skills that translated surprisingly well to more covert activities. By 6 o'clock that evening, I was positioned at a corner table in the bar area of Romano's, wearing sunglasses and a black wig I'd purchased that afternoon, carrying a professional-grade camera with a telephoto lens that I'd rented from a photography shop downtown. I looked like any other woman having a drink while waiting for a friend, invisible and unremarkable, and perfectly positioned to document whatever happened next. David and Elena arrived at 7:30, and I had to grip my wine. glass tightly to keep from trembling as I watched them being seated at an intimate table in the restaurant's main dining room. They looked like lovers. There was no other way to describe it. The way Elena touched David's arm as they were led to their table, the way David held her chair for her, the way they leaned toward each other once they were seated, suggested a relationship that had moved far beyond professional mentorship. I photographed everything. David and Elena studying their menus together, their heads close enough to touch. Elena laughing at something David said, her hand resting on his forearm in a gesture that was clearly possessive. David reaching across the table to brush a strand of hair from Elena's face, his fingers lingering against her cheek in a caress that made my stomach clench with fury. But it was what happened after dinner that provided the most damning evidence. As they prepared to leave the restaurant, David helped Elena into her coat, his hands resting on her shoulders for several seconds longer than necessary. Then, in full view of anyone who might be watching, he leaned down and kissed her. Not a social kiss, not a professional peck on the cheek, but a real kiss. Passionate and intimate, and absolutely unmistakable. I captured it all through the telephoto lens. Frame after frame of my husband's betrayal documented in sharp detail. David and Elena kissing in the restaurant's foyer, walking hand in hand toward the parking garage. Elena looking up at David with an expression of such complete adoration that it made me physically ill. They drove away in David's car, probably, heading to Elena's apartment for the rest of the evening. I sat in the restaurant's bar area for another hour, reviewing the photographs on my camera's display screen, making sure I'd captured enough evidence to support whatever actions I decided to take. The photographs were perfect, crystal clear, and absolutely incriminating. David could never claim that his relationship with Elena was purely professional, not with these images showing him kissing her passionately in a public restaurant. Elena could never pretend that she was an innocent victim of an older man's advances, not when every frame showed her as an equal and enthusiastic participant in their affair. But photographs alone wouldn't be enough for what I was planning. I needed Elena to reveal her true character, needed David to demonstrate exactly how little he respected me and our marriage. I needed them both to make mistakes that would justify the magnitude of the consequences I was preparing to deliver. That night, when David came home at nearly midnight, I pretended to be asleep. He slipped into bed beside me, smelling of Elena's perfume and wine and lies, and I lay there in the darkness planning his destruction with the same meticulous attention I'd once devoted to planning his dinner parties. David thought he was clever, thought he was managing his double life with skill and discretion. Elena thought she was sophisticated, thought she was playing a game she understood and controlled. They were both about to learn how wrong they were. And when the lesson was over, neither of them would ever underestimate Sarah Thompson again. The opportunity came 3 weeks later, delivered to me wrapped in David's casual arrogance like a gift I'd been waiting my entire marriage to receive. He announced over breakfast that he was hosting a dinner party at our home the following Saturday, a celebration for the successful conclusion of the Henderson case that had supposedly required so much intensive collaboration with Elena Martinez. "Just a small gathering," he said, not looking up from his newspaper as he delivered this bombshell. The senior partners, a few key associates, some clients who were instrumental in the victory, maybe 20 people total. Elena suggested it would be more intimate than a restaurant, and I thought our home would provide the perfect setting. Elena had suggested it. Of course she had. The woman who had accepted my hospitality while conducting an affair with my husband was now orchestrating another performance in my dining room, another opportunity to use my domestic skills as the backdrop for her relationship with David. The audacity was breathtaking, even by Elena's standards. "How wonderful," I said, my voice steady despite the rage building in my chest. "I assume you'll want the full treatment? Cocktail hour, seated dinner, perhaps champagne for toasts? We should discuss the menu and the guest list so I can plan." Accordingly, David finally looked up from his paper, and I saw surprise flicker across his face. He'd expected resistance, complaints about the short notice and the complexity of entertaining his colleagues. Instead, he was getting enthusiastic. Cooperation from the wife he'd underestimated so completely. That would be perfect, he said slowly. Elena mentioned that she'd be happy to help with the preparations if you need assistance. She's quite accomplished when it comes to event planning. Elena wanted to help plan the party. Elena, who had never set foot in my kitchen except as a guest, who had complimented my cooking while stealing my husband, wanted to collaborate on organizing an event in my own home. The sheer presumption of it almost made me laugh out loud. How thoughtful of her, I replied. I'd love her input. Why don't you have her call me this afternoon so we can coordinate our efforts? David beamed at me with genuine warmth for the first time in months. You're incredible, Sarah. I know this is short notice, and I appreciate how graciously you're handling it. This party means a lot to me professionally, and I want everything to be perfect. Perfect. Yes, everything was going to be absolutely perfect, just not in the way David was imagining. Elena called that afternoon at exactly 3 o'clock, her voice professionally cheerful as she introduced herself as if we hadn't spent an entire evening together in my dining room just weeks earlier. Mrs. Thompson, David mentioned that you might appreciate some assistance with Saturday's dinner party. I hope you don't mind me reaching out directly. Please, call me Sarah. I said, settling into the kitchen chair where I'd planned so many menus over the years. And I'd welcome your help. David tells me you have excellent taste when it comes to entertaining. I do enjoy hosting, Elena replied, and I could hear the smile in her voice. There's something so satisfying about creating the perfect atmosphere for important conversations and connections. David mentioned that this party is quite significant for the firm, so I want to make sure every detail is flawless. We spent the next hour discussing logistics with the kind of meticulous attention that would have impressed a professional event planner. Elena had strong opinions about everything from the wine selection to the floral arrangements, and she shared them with the confidence of someone who considered herself an expert on sophisticated entertaining. She also had very specific ideas about the seating arrangement, suggesting that she be placed near David so they could coordinate their presentations about the Henderson case victory. After all, she said, David and I were the primary team on this case. It makes sense for us to be positioned where we can easily collaborate on the evening's narrative. The evening's narrative. Elena spoke about David's dinner party like it was a theatrical production, which in many ways it was. She was planning to use my home, my hospitality, and my cooking as the stage for another performance of her relationship with my husband. She was going to sit at my table, eat food I'd prepared, and bask in the admiration of David's colleagues while I served them like hired help. That makes perfect sense, I agreed. I'll make sure you and David are seated where you can present your partnership most effectively. Partnership. The word tasted bitter in my mouth, but Elena responded to it with obvious pleasure. Exactly. David and I have developed such a strong working relationship over these past months. It's been incredibly rewarding to collaborate with someone who truly understands my capabilities and potential. By the time we hung up, I had agreed to Elena's suggestions for nearly every aspect of the party, while she had unknowingly provided me with everything I needed to ensure that Saturday evening would be the most memorable dinner party of her life. She wanted to be the center of attention alongside David, wanted to demonstrate their partnership to his colleagues, wanted to use my home as the stage for her triumph. I was going to give her exactly what she wanted, and then I was going to destroy her with it. The next few days passed in a whirlwind of preparation that reminded me why I'd once loved entertaining. There was something deeply satisfying about orchestrating a complex event, coordinating multiple moving parts to create a seamless experience for guests. I ordered flowers from the best florist in town, selected wines that would complement each course, polished silver and crystal until everything gleamed with perfection. But underneath the familiar rhythm of party planning, I was executing a much more complex strategy. Every decision I made, every detail I arranged, was designed to serve the larger purpose of exposing David and Elena's affair in the most devastating way possible. This wasn't just going to be a dinner party. This was going to be a trial, with me as both prosecutor and judge. I hired a photographer, telling him that I wanted to document this important professional milestone for David's career. Marcus Chen was a freelance photographer who specialized in corporate events, and he was thrilled to have a last-minute booking that paid his premium weekend rate. What he didn't know was that I'd selected him specifically because he was a stranger, someone with no connection to David's professional circle who wouldn't hesitate to capture whatever moments I directed him toward. "I want candid shots," I told Marcus during our planning meeting. "Natural interactions, genuine emotions, the kind of photographs that really capture the essence of people's relationships with each other. Don't worry about being subtle or discreet. The more authentic, the better." Marcus nodded enthusiastically. I love that approach. Too many corporate events end up with stiff, posed photographs that don't tell any real stories. You want me to focus on the human connections, the way people actually relate to each other when they think no one's watching. "Exactly," I said. "Especially the interactions between David and his associates. This is such an important moment in his career, and I want to make sure we capture how his colleagues really feel about working with him." I also made one addition to the guest list that David didn't know about. Patricia Henderson, the wife of the client whose case had supposedly brought David and Elena together, had called earlier in the week to thank me for David's excellent representation of her husband's interests. During our conversation, she'd mentioned how much she'd enjoyed working with David's team, particularly the brilliant young woman who'd been so instrumental in developing their legal strategy. "Elena Martinez is remarkable," Patricia had gushed. "So intelligent, so dedicated. Your husband is lucky to have someone like that supporting his work. She's going to go far in this profession, mark my words." Patricia clearly had no idea about the nature of David and Elena's collaboration, which made her the perfect witness for what I was planning. I invited her and her husband to attend Saturday's celebration, telling her that David would be thrilled to have the clients who'd made the victory possible share in the commemoration. "How thoughtful," Patricia had exclaimed. "We'd be honored to attend. Richard will be so pleased to celebrate with the people who worked so hard on his behalf." By Friday evening, everything was in place. The menu was planned, the wines were selected, the flowers were arranged, the photographer was briefed, and the guest list was complete. 22 people would be dining at my table the following night, including the 2 people who had betrayed me and the witnesses who would ensure that their destruction was both public and permanent. David spent Friday evening in his study, supposedly preparing remarks for the dinner party, but actually on the phone with Elena, coordinating their strategy for the evening ahead. I could hear him through the closed door, his voice animated with excitement as he discussed how they would present their professional partnership to his colleagues. What he didn't know was that I'd been listening to these conversations for weeks, recording them through the baby monitor I'd installed in his study while he was at work. David and Elena had been remarkably candid during their private calls, discussing not just their legal strategies, but their personal relationship, their plans for the future, and their complete confidence that I suspected nothing about their affair. Those recordings were going to provide the soundtrack for Saturday evening's entertainment. Saturday morning dawned crisp and clear, perfect weather for the garden party atmosphere I'd created on our back terrace. I spent the morning arranging flowers, setting up the bar, and putting the finishing touches on a tablescape that would have impressed the editors of any lifestyle magazine. Everything looked elegant and welcoming, the kind of sophisticated setting where successful people gathered to celebrate important achievements. David was nervous, I noticed, checking his appearance in the mirror multiple times and asking my opinion about his tie selection with the kind of anxiety he usually reserved for major court appearances. "I want everything to be perfect tonight," he said as he adjusted his cufflinks for the 3rd time. This party could be very important for my standing at the firm. Everything will be perfect, I assured him, straightening his collar with the same careful attention I'd always paid. To his appearance, you look distinguished and successful, exactly the way a senior partner should look. Everyone will be impressed. Elena's bringing a gift, he mentioned casually, though I caught the underlying excitement in his voice. Something to commemorate. Our success on the Henderson case. She has such thoughtful gestures. A gift from Elena. How perfectly appropriate. I wondered if it was something personal disguised as professional. Another way for her to mark her territory while maintaining the facade of propriety. Whatever it was, it would provide excellent material for the evening's revelations. The first guests arrived at 6:30, and I slipped seamlessly into my role as the gracious hostess, greeting each arrival with genuine warmth while mentally cataloging their potential value as witnesses to what was coming. The senior partners arrived in expensive cars with their perfectly groomed wives, followed by the associates who were eager to impress their superiors, and finally, the clients, whose victory had supposedly necessitated this celebration. Marcus, the photographer, moved through the crowd with professional discretion, capturing candid moments of conversation and laughter, while I made sure he understood which interactions were most important to document. Make sure you get plenty of shots of David with his team, I told him during a quiet moment, especially his collaboration with Elena Martinez. Their partnership has been the key to this whole victory. Elena arrived fashionably late, making an entrance that was clearly calculated for maximum impact. She wore a stunning red dress that hugged her curves and showcased her figure, paired with jewelry that definitely hadn't come from a junior associate's salary. Every man in the room noticed her arrival, and every woman evaluated her as potential competition with the kind of instant assessment that happens at these professional gatherings. But it was David's reaction that Marcus captured most clearly. The way his face lit up when Elena walked through the door, the way he immediately excused himself from his conversation with a senior partner to greet her, the way his hand lingered on her waist as he guided her into the party. To anyone who knew how to read body language, David's feelings for Elena were absolutely obvious. "Mrs. Thompson," Elena said when David brought her over to me, her smile perfect and her voice warm, with false sincerity. "Everything looks absolutely magnificent. You've outdone yourself." "Thank you," I replied, accepting the air kiss she offered while noting that she smelled like David's cologne. "You look stunning tonight. That dress is perfect for celebrating such an important victory." "David helped me pick it out," she said, apparently unable to resist the subtle claim of ownership. "He has such excellent taste when it comes to knowing what works for special occasions." David had helped her shop for clothing. The intimacy implied by that revelation would have devastated me a month ago, but tonight it simply provided more ammunition for what was coming. "He's always been very attentive to details," I said. "It's one of the things that makes him such an excellent lawyer and such a wonderful husband." I saw Elena's smile falter slightly at the word husband, a tiny crack in her composure that suggested she wasn't quite as confident about her position as she pretended to be. Good. Uncertainty would make her more likely to make mistakes as the evening progressed. Cocktail hour proceeded exactly as I'd planned, with guests mingling on the terrace while enjoying the carefully selected wines and the elaborate spread of appetizers I'd prepared. Marcus moved through the crowd, capturing conversations, and I made sure he was positioned to photograph every interaction between David and Elena, the way they gravitated toward each other despite being surrounded by other people, the way Elena touched David's arm when she laughed at his jokes, the way David's attention remained focused on her even when other people were speaking to him. Patricia Henderson proved to be exactly the witness I'd hoped for, watching David and Elena's interactions with the kind of innocent fascination that comes from observing what you think is a purely professional partnership. "They work so beautifully together," she told me during a quiet moment. "You can see how much respect they have for each other's abilities. Your husband is such a good mentor to young lawyers." He certainly is, I agreed. David believes strongly in nurturing talent and helping promising associates reach their full potential. He's very hands-on in his approach to professional development. As we moved into dinner, I executed the seating arrangement Elena had requested, placing her directly to David's right while I took my traditional position at the foot of the table. From my seat, I had a perfect view of their interactions, and more importantly, so did Marcus and the other guests. David and Elena might think they were being subtle, but their chemistry was obvious to anyone who bothered to pay attention. The meal proceeded flawlessly, each course perfectly timed and beautifully presented. I'd outdone myself with the menu, creating the kind of sophisticated dining experience that would be remembered and discussed for months afterward. Guests complimented every dish, praised the wine selections, and marveled at the attention to detail that had gone into every aspect of the evening. But the real entertainment began during the toasts, when David stood to address his guests and thank them for celebrating this important professional milestone. He spoke eloquently about the challenges of the Henderson case, the teamwork required to achieve victory, and the bright future that lay ahead for his firm. He was in his element, commanding the room with the kind of charismatic authority that had first attracted me to him 20 years ago. Then he turned to Elena, raising his glass in her direction as he prepared to acknowledge her contribution to their success. "I also want to recognize someone who has been instrumental in this victory," he said, his voice taking on a warmer, more personal tone. "Elena Martinez joined our team less than a year ago, but she's already proven herself to be an invaluable asset. Her intelligence, her dedication, her innovative thinking have made her indispensable to our practice." Indispensable. The word hung in the air like a declaration of love, disguised as professional praise. Elena's face glowed with pleasure as every eye in the room focused on her, and I saw her hand move almost imperceptibly toward David's on the table. "Elena," David continued, "your contributions to this case and to our firm cannot be overstated. You've brought fresh perspectives, tireless energy, and exceptional skill to everything we've undertaken together. I look forward to many more years of successful collaboration." Many more years. David wasn't just acknowledging Elena's professional value, he was announcing his intention to keep her close, to continue their partnership indefinitely. The message was clear to anyone who understood. The subtext, Elena Martinez was not going anywhere. Elena stood to respond, her own glass raised as she prepared to deliver her carefully rehearsed remarks. "David," she said, her voice carrying easily through the quiet dining room, "working with you has been the greatest privilege of my career. Your guidance, your trust, your willingness to invest in my development as a lawyer have meant more to me than I can adequately express." She paused, looking directly at David with an intensity that made several guests shift uncomfortably in their seats. "The partnership we've built over these past months has been extraordinary, both professionally and personally. You've taught me that the best collaborations are built on mutual respect, shared values, and deep personal connection." Personal connection. Elena was being as explicit as she dared in front of a room full of witnesses, claiming David publicly, while maintaining just enough professional language to preserve plausible deniability. It was a masterful performance, and she clearly expected to get away with it. That's when I decided it was time to present my own gift to the evening's celebration. "Before we continue," I said, rising from my seat with my own glass in hand, "I have a surprise for David and Elena, something to commemorate this special partnership they've been describing." I moved to the sideboard where I'd placed a wrapped package earlier in the evening, lifting it carefully as every eye in the room followed my movements. "David," I said, "you've always told me that the most important thing in any relationship is honesty. Complete transparency between partners who trust each other implicitly." David was looking at me with confusion now, uncertainty flickering across his face as he tried to understand where this was leading. Elena had gone very still, her wine glass frozen halfway to her lips. So, I thought it would be appropriate to share some evidence of just how transparent and honest your partnership with Elena has been. I began unwrapping the package, revealing a large tablet computer that I'd loaded with very specific content. These are photographs from your business dinners over the past several months. Documentation of the professional collaboration you've been celebrating tonight. I turned on the tablet and placed it on the table where everyone could see the screen, then pressed play on the slideshow I'd prepared. The first image appeared immediately. David and Elena at Romano's restaurant, leaning across their table. In animated conversation, their body language unmistakably intimate. The room fell completely silent as the slideshow continued, each photograph more damning than the last. David and Elena walking hand in hand down a Manhattan street. Elena adjusting David's collar outside her apartment building. David and Elena kissing passionately in the restaurant foyer, their bodies pressed together in a way that left no doubt about the nature of their relationship. "This is what honest partnership looks like," I said, my voice carrying clearly in the shocked silence. "Complete transparency between colleagues who trust each other with everything." David had gone white, his mouth opening and closing without sound as he stared at the incriminating images cycling across the tablet screen. Elena looked like she might be sick, her face drained of all color except for 2 bright spots of red high on her cheekbones. But I wasn't finished. The photographs were just the opening act in the performance I'd been planning for weeks. And since we're celebrating transparency, I continued, pulling out my phone and connecting it to the wireless speakers I'd hidden around the dining room, I thought you might also enjoy listening to some of the private conversations David and Elena have shared while planning this wonderful evening. I pressed play, and David's voice filled the room, crystal clear through the high-quality speakers. The first recording was from 2 weeks ago, David and Elena discussing the dinner party while expressing their confidence that I suspected nothing about their affair. "Sarah's so trusting," Elena's voice said through the speakers. "She actually thinks I want to help her plan your dinner party because I care about your professional success. It's almost sweet how naive she is." "She's always been naive," David's voice replied. "It's one of the things that made her such an easy wife to manage. She focuses on domestic details and lets me handle everything that actually matters. She'll never question what we're doing as long as I keep coming home at night." The guests were staring at the speakers in horror, then at David and Elena, then at me, trying to process what they were hearing. Several people had started reaching for their phones, undoubtedly to record this unprecedented collapse of professional propriety. "I almost feel guilty sometimes," Elena's voice continued from the recording, "using her hospitality while sleeping with her husband. But she makes it so easy, playing the perfect hostess while I take everything she values most." "Don't feel guilty," David's voice responded. "Sarah chose to make herself dispensable. She could have stayed relevant to my life if she'd bothered, to grow and evolve instead of settling into suburban complacency. You represent everything she isn't: intelligent, ambitious, stimulating. She's had 18 years to keep my interest, and she failed." The recording continued for another 30 seconds, David and Elena discussing their plans for the future, their intention to be more open about their relationship after the Henderson case concluded, their confidence that I would accept whatever arrangements they decided to make because I was too dependent and too intimidated to challenge them. When the recording ended, the silence in the dining room was absolutely deafening. 22 people sat frozen in their chairs, wine glasses forgotten, staring at David and Elena with expressions of shock and disgust. Patricia Henderson looked like she might faint, her husband's face dark with anger as he processed what he'd just witnessed. The senior partners were exchanging glances that suggested immediate and severe professional consequences were being calculated in real time. But it was Marcus the photographer who provided the perfect final touch to the evening's entertainment. He'd been capturing every moment of the revelation, every expression of shock and betrayal and humiliation that had crossed David and Elena's faces as their carefully constructed lies collapsed around them. "Mrs. Thompson," he said, lowering his camera with a satisfied smile. "I think I got exactly the kind of authentic human emotions you were looking for." The aftermath unfolded exactly as I'd orchestrated it, like dominoes falling in perfect sequence. Within minutes of the recording's ending, guests began making hasty excuses to leave. The senior partners departed first, their faces grim with the kind of professional disgust that spelled immediate career consequences. Patricia Henderson actually apologized to me before leaving, her husband muttering something about misplaced trust and poor character judgment. David sat frozen in his chair, staring at the tablet screen that had gone dark, but somehow still seemed to glow with accusation. Elena had fled to the bathroom and hadn't returned, though I could hear her making frantic phone calls through the closed door, probably trying to spin some version of events that might salvage her reputation. Marcus packed up his equipment with professional efficiency, but not before handing me a business card. "Mrs. Thompson, if you ever need documentation services again, please don't hesitate to call. That was some of the most authentic, emotional photography I've ever captured." He paused at the door, glancing back at David's motionless figure. Some people really don't appreciate what they have until it's gone. By 9 o'clock, only David, Elena, and I remained in the house that had hosted their public destruction. Elena finally emerged from the bathroom, her makeup repaired, but her composure shattered. She looked between David and me like a cornered animal, clearly hoping he would take charge of the situation and somehow rescue them both from the consequences of their exposure. "Sarah," David finally spoke, his voice hoarse with shock. "We need to talk about this privately. There are things you don't understand, context that might help explain." "Explain what exactly?" I interrupted, beginning to clear the abandoned wine glasses from the table with steady hands. "Explain how you've been conducting an affair for months while using my home as your personal restaurant? Explain how you've both been lying to my face while planning your future together? Or explain how you thought I was too stupid to notice what was happening in my own dining room?" Elena stepped forward, apparently deciding that feminine solidarity might be her best strategy. "Sarah, I know how this must look, but the situation is more complicated than you realize. David and I never intended for things to develop the way they did. Sometimes professional relationships evolve in unexpected directions." "Professional relationships," I repeated, setting down a crystal glass with perhaps more force than necessary. "Is that what we're calling adultery now? How progressive of you." "This doesn't have to destroy everything," David said, finally standing and moving toward me with his hands raised in a gesture of placation. "We're all adults here. We can find a way to handle this situation that protects everyone's interests." The audacity was breathtaking. Even caught red-handed, even publicly humiliated in front of his colleagues and clients, David was still trying to negotiate terms as if this were just another business deal to be managed. "You're absolutely right," I said, smiling at him with genuine warmth for the first time in months. "We are all adults, and adults face the consequences of their choices, which is why I've already spoken with my attorney about filing for divorce on grounds of adultery. The photographs and recordings should make the proceedings quite straightforward." David's face went white. "Sarah, be reasonable. Think about what you're throwing away. Our home, our life together, the financial security I've provided. Is one mistake really worth destroying 18 years of marriage? One mistake?" I laughed, and the sound echoed strangely in the suddenly empty dining room. "David, this wasn't a mistake. This was a systematic campaign of deception that lasted for months. You brought your mistress into our home and made me serve you dinner while you planned your future together. That's not a mistake. That's cruelty." Elena's phone buzzed with what must have been the 20th call since the evening's revelations. She glanced at the screen and her face crumpled with despair. "That's Mr. Whitman," she whispered. "The managing partner. He's been calling for an hour." "You should probably answer it," I suggested helpfully. I'm sure he has many questions about your professional conduct and judgment. The firm's reputation is so important in these matters. Elena's career was over, and we all knew it. No reputable law firm would keep an associate who'd been caught conducting an affair with a married partner, especially not after such a public and documented exposure. The legal profession might tolerate many things, but it had little patience for practitioners who brought scandal and embarrassment to their employers. David's position was more secure due to his seniority and client relationships, but the damage to his reputation would be severe and lasting. Word of tonight's dinner party would spread through the legal community like wildfire, carried by the 20 witnesses who'd seen his humiliation firsthand. He would survive professionally, but he would never again command the respect and authority he'd worked so hard to build. "I want you both out of my house," I said calmly, beginning to blow out the candles that had illuminated our elegant dinner party. "Elena, I assume you have somewhere to go. David, you can stay at your club until you find more permanent arrangements. I'll have your belongings packed and ready for pickup by Monday." "This is my house too," David protested, finally showing some fire. "You can't just throw me out of my own home." "Actually, I can," I replied, consulting the legal documents I'd prepared weeks ago. "Our prenuptial agreement, which you insisted on before our marriage, contains a very clear morality clause. In the event of proven adultery, the offending party forfeits all claims to marital property. Your affair is now very well documented, so the house is mine, along with the bank accounts, the investment portfolio, and most of your assets." David snatched the papers from my hands, scanning them with the desperate intensity of a man watching his entire life collapse. "You've been planning this," he said accusingly. "This whole evening was a setup." "Of course it was a setup," I agreed. "Did you really think I would just accept being humiliated in my own home? Did you honestly believe I was too naive to recognize what you were doing? You both underestimated me completely, and now you're facing the consequences of that miscalculation." Elena was crying now, mascara streaming down her cheeks as the full scope of her situation became clear. Her career was destroyed, her reputation was in ruins, and the man she'd thrown everything away for was about to lose most of his assets in divorce proceedings. The sophisticated young lawyer who'd thought she could manipulate her way to success had played herself out of everything she'd worked to achieve. "I'm sorry," she whispered, though whether she was apologizing to me or to David was unclear. "I never meant for things to go this far. I thought we could handle the situation more discreetly." "The time for discretion was before you started sleeping with my husband," I replied. "Now you'll both have to live with the choices you made." David made one final attempt at salvaging something from the wreckage. "Sarah, if you go through with this divorce, you'll be alone. Middle-aged, starting over, trying to rebuild your life without the security and social position you've enjoyed as my wife. Is your pride really worth throwing away everything we've built together?" I looked at my husband, this man who had shared my bed for 18 years while planning his betrayal, and felt nothing but pity for his complete failure to understand what he'd lost. "David, I've been alone for months while you conducted your affair. The difference is that now I'm choosing to be alone rather than pretending I have a marriage worth preserving." Elena's phone rang again, and this time she answered it with the resignation of someone who had no choice but to face the inevitable. Her side of the conversation was brief and predictable: apologetic explanations, desperate attempts at damage control, and finally the quiet acceptance of immediate termination. When she hung up, her career in law was officially over. "They want—" "My keycard and computer returned immediately," she said numbly. "Security will escort me out if I try to enter the building." David ran his hands through his hair, destroying the careful styling he'd spent so much time perfecting earlier that evening. "This is insane. One dinner party can't destroy everything we've worked for." "It wasn't the dinner party that destroyed everything," I corrected. "It was your decision to conduct an affair while treating me like hired help in my own home. The dinner party was just the venue for your accountability. As they gathered their things and prepared to leave my house for the last time as unwelcome guests rather than residents, I felt a profound sense of peace settling over me. For months, I'd been living a lie, playing the role of the devoted wife while my husband pursued another woman. Tonight, I'd finally spoken the truth, and the relief was overwhelming. David paused at the front door, looking back at the home where we'd built our life together. "You'll regret this, Sarah. When you're living alone in some small apartment, struggling to make ends meet, you'll remember what you threw away tonight." "The only thing I'm throwing away is the illusion that I was married to a man worth respecting," I replied. "Good luck rebuilding your reputation and your relationship with someone whose career you've just destroyed." After they left, I poured myself a glass of the excellent wine Elena had helped me select and sat in my living room, surrounded by the remnants of the most successful dinner party I'd ever hosted. The evening had accomplished everything I'd hoped for and more. David and Elena's affair was exposed, their reputations were destroyed, their careers were damaged, and their future together was indefinitely complicated by scandal and financial ruin. But more importantly, I was free. Free from the exhausting work of pretending my marriage was healthy. Free from the humiliation of being betrayed in my own home. Free from the suffocating role of the perfect wife who turned a blind eye to her husband's cruelty. The next morning, I called my attorney to begin divorce proceedings and my real estate agent to discuss selling the house. The home that had been the stage for so much deception needed to become the foundation for a fresh start. I would take my settlement money and build a new life somewhere else, somewhere that wasn't haunted by memories of 18 years of gradually diminishing respect and love. 6 months later, I was living in a charming cottage by the sea, working part-time at a local art gallery and taking painting classes at the community college. The divorce had been swift and decisive, David's documented adultery making any contest futile. Elena had left New York entirely, reportedly working as a paralegal in some small Midwestern town where her scandal hadn't followed her. David had been forced to take a position with a much smaller firm, his reputation and client base severely damaged by the very public nature of his humiliation. Sometimes I wondered if I'd been too harsh, if there might have been a more private way to handle their betrayal. But then I remembered the sound of Elena's laughter as she talked about taking everything I valued while I served them dinner. And I knew I'd chosen exactly the right response to their calculated cruelty. Justice, it turned out, was best served at the perfect temperature, with the finest china, and in front of the most distinguished witnesses. And the taste of it was absolutely exquisite. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.